Sometimes the darkest stories rise from the places you least expect. Finland, for years crowned the happiest nation on earth, praised for its peace, its beauty, its safety. A country where crime feels distant, almost unthinkable. Beneath that image lies a wound that never healed. A case that has haunted Finland for more than 6 decades. On the shores of Lake Bodom, 3 teenagers were brutally murdered. Their friend, the only survivor, left broken and bloodied. What should have been a quiet summer night became one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in the world. Today, when you search for Lake Bodom, you don't see just a postcard of calm waters and forests. You see headlines of horror. You see a mystery that has resisted the truth for over 60 years. This is the case of the Lake Bodom murders. Summer of 1960. Long days, clear skies, and the calm promise of another season by the lakes. For most, it was a time of quiet, of freedom, of teenagers slipping away from home to taste independence in the outdoors. But on the morning of June 5th, that image shattered forever. 3 young lives were taken in an attack so brutal and so senseless that it carved its way into history. They were murdered in their sleep. A 4th left bleeding, barely alive, and an entire country left stunned. The scale of the tragedy and the failure to solve it turned the Lake Bodom murders into a national wound. From the start, the case captured headlines and never really let go. Every decade since, the murders have been revisited in books and documentaries. They've inspired podcasts that analyze the evidence detail by detail. Even the horror film Lake Bodom reimagined the story for a new generation, blending fact and fiction, but always returning to the same chilling truth. No one has ever been convicted. The case became larger than just a local crime. It became a cultural phenomenon, a reminder that even in a nation considered one of the safest in the world, darkness can appear when you least expect it. To the people of Finland, Lake Bodom is not just a lake. It's a symbol. Mention its name, and most will immediately think not of fishing or summer afternoons, but of a tent slashed open in the night, of 3 teenagers who never made it home, and of a mystery that refused to die. The story of Lake Bodom can't be understood without the lake itself. On the surface, it's everything calm waters surrounded by forests, a stretch of peace only a few kilometers west of Helsinki. To visitors, it looked like the perfect escape. A pocket of nature where young people could swim, camp, and taste a bit of freedom. But for locals, there was an edge to that beauty. The lake carried a reputation, not of ghosts or curses yet, but of a man who made it his mission to drive campers away. They called him the Kiosk Man. People knew he cut down tents, threw stones, and treated that patch of shoreline like his own. Outsiders didn't always know the stories, and in June of 1960, 4 teenagers from Espoo decided that the lake was where they'd spend the night. Maila Irmeli Björklund, just 15 years old. Anja Tulikimäki, also 15. With them were their boyfriends, both 18. Seppo Antero Boisman and Niels Wilhelm Gustafsson. They were young, hopeful, and looking for nothing more than a simple summer retreat. A single tent, 2 couples, the kind of trip countless teenagers before and after have taken without a second thought. That afternoon, everything went smoothly. They set up their tent on the shoreline, away from the roads, with the water just steps away. It was ordinary setting. Laughter, privacy, and the freedom that comes with being on the edge of adulthood. No one could have predicted that this ordinary scene was about to turn into one of Finland's darkest nights. To understand the weight of what happened, it's important to see them as they were. Not headlines, not names in a case file, but teenagers. Mila was Niels's girlfriend. Anya was with Seppo. Two pairs of young people at the very start of their lives. For them, this trip was a chance to enjoy each other's company, to be away from home, to live the kind of moment teenagers everywhere look forward to when summer begins. As evening fell, the lake was quiet. Just 4 teenagers tucked into their tent, ready for the night. For them, it was the end of a long day. For history, it was the last moment of normalcy, because by the time the sun rose again, only one of them would be left alive. By nightfall, the 4 teenagers had settled into their tent, unaware that their choice of campsite would become infamous. The lake was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the world feel safe. But sometime in the early hours of June 5th, between 4 and 6 a.m., that silence was shattered. What happened inside and around that tent was not the work of a clumsy robbery, nor a drunken brawl. It was an attack carried out with force, precision, and rage. The assailant didn't walk into the tent. He struck from the outside. Using a knife and an unidentified blunt object, the killer slashed and stabbed through the canvas walls, raining blows on the teenagers trapped inside. The tent, meant to protect them, became their prison. The details uncovered later paint a picture of horror. Inside, both Seppo Boisman and Anya Maki were attacked where they lay. They never made it out. The killer stabbed and bludgeoned them through the fabric, their lives ending in the very place they had sought rest. But it was different for Mela, Ermeli Björklund. She was found outside, her body sprawled across the collapsed tent. She had been undressed from the waist down, and she suffered the worst of it. Multiple stab wounds, some inflicted even after her death. The violence toward her was far greater, almost personal. Whether she was dragged out or tried to escape, we don't know. What we do know is that her injuries told a story of fury and brutality. And then there was Niels Gustafsson, the sole survivor. He too had been struck hard. His jaw was broken, his cheekbones fractured. His head bore deep wounds from a knife. He was discovered unconscious, lying near the tent. Unlike his friends, he clung to life. Later, when he recovered enough to speak, he would claim he saw only a glimpse of the attacker, a figure dressed in black with bright red eyes. By dawn, the scene was unrecognizable from the peaceful lakeside where the teenagers had fallen asleep. The tent was torn open, slashed in several places, collapsed under the weight of the violence inside and out. Its canvas walls, once white, were soaked with blood. The belongings of the group were scattered or missing, some carried off and later found hidden in the brush. The motorcycles they had ridden to the site were untouched, but their keys were gone, which add a strange layer to the crime. In those 2 hours before sunrise, Lake Bodom transformed from a quiet refuge to a crime scene that would haunt Finland for decades. No one saw the killer arrive, and no one saw him leave, except perhaps the boys who would appear later that morning, reporting a tall blonde man walking away from the collapsed tent. What exactly happened in those dark hours may never be fully known, but the facts left behind, the shredded tent, the mutilated bodies, and the lone survivor, have ensured that the mystery of Lake Bodom would never be forgotten. Video Part 5, Discovery of the Crime. The next morning the sun rose as if nothing had happened, but inside that torn tent lay the aftermath. 3 teenagers murdered, 1 barely alive, and no trace of the assailant. The first people to notice something was wrong were a group of young bird watchers. Around 6 in the morning, as they moved through the forest, they caught sight of the campsite. From a distance, the tent looked strange. Its shape collapsed, its canvas hanging unnaturally. Then they saw something else. walking away from the shoreline. He didn't run. He didn't look panicked. He simply walked, vanishing into the trees as though leaving an ordinary morning behind. The boys kept moving, not realizing they might have just seen the last person connected to the murders. Hours passed. The tent remained, slashed and silent. Inside, the bodies of Anya Tulikimeki and Seppo Boisman lay where they had been attacked. Outside, Mila Irmeli Björklund was sprawled across the tent, her injuries hidden from anyone passing by. Niels Gustafsson, unconscious and bleeding, lay close by. For more than 5 hours, no one came to help. It wasn't until around 11 a.m. that the true horror was discovered. A carpenter named Risto Siren, though some records list him as Esko Oiva Johansson, came across the scene while walking near the lake. What he saw was nothing like the peaceful campsite that had been set up the day before. The tent was torn open, collapsed under its own weight, blood seeping through the fabric. 3 teenagers were lying dead. One boy, Gustafsson, still clung to life, but his face was brutally shattered. Siren immediately informed the authorities. Police were notified, and by noon, officers arrived at the shoreline. But by then, it was far too late to catch the killer. Whoever had struck in the night had been gone for more than 6 hours, long enough to disappear into the countryside, long enough to hide weapons, clothing, or anything else that might connect him to the crime. That delay, those missing hours, would haunt the case forever. The window of opportunity to secure the crime scene, to trace footsteps, to follow a suspect, had already closed. By the time authorities began their work, the trail had gone cold. What was left was the carnage. 3 young victims, 1 battered survivor, and the eerie image of a tent soaked in blood by the edge of a lake that had turned from sanctuary to nightmare. Now, apart from arriving late, the one thing investigators could have controlled, the crime scene itself, slipped away almost instantly. Instead of locking down the area, officers allowed people to come and go. There were no barriers, no cordon, no attempt to preserve evidence. Curious locals wandered in. Journalists with cameras walked over bloodstains. Even campers who had heard about the murders came close enough to disturb what little clues the killer might have left behind. Every step, every footprint erased something important. In those first few hours, the investigation was crippled beyond repair. As if that wasn't enough, police made another disastrous decision. In a rush to find missing items, they brought in soldiers to help sweep the area. Dozens of boots trampled through the shoreline, the forest paths, and the brush surrounding the tent. Any trace of the murderer, whether it was footprints, fibers, or blood, was buried under the chaos. The very people brought in to help destroyed the ground the investigators should have been protecting. What survived was confusing at best. Some personal belongings of the victims were gone, but others remained. The motorcycles that had carried the teenagers to the lake were still there, but their keys had been taken. Wallets disappeared, and Gustafsson's shoes, strangely missing from the campsite, were later found half a kilometer away. Why would the killer carry them off, only to discard them in the woods? Was it an attempt to mislead investigators, or the careless act of someone trying to cover his tracks in the dark? We don't know. The most critical items, however, were never recovered: the weapons themselves. The knife and blunt object used to slaughter 3 people left no trace. No handle, no blade, no rock with blood, nothing. Without the murder weapons, police had little to connect any suspect to the scene. Over the years, more fragments emerged, but always too late. Pieces of clothing belonging to the teenagers were found hidden in the forest, far from where they were. After a few years, Investigators even uncovered a human tooth inside the tent, a clue that should have been noticed immediately in 1960. By then, it was meaningless. Time had washed away context, and the chain of evidence had been broken beyond repair. Each mistake compounded the others. Had the crime scene been preserved from the start, investigators might have followed a trail, prints leading away from the tent, blood traces pointing to a suspect, weapons hidden but traceable. Instead, they were left with a mess, conflicting accounts, items scattered without explanation, and the sinking realization that whatever the truth was, it had already slipped into the soil, into the water, and into the shadows of the lake. The Lake Bodom murders became infamous not just because of their brutality, but because of this failure. The sense that the case could have been solved, that the killer could have been caught, if only the first officers had done their job differently. Instead, the mistakes of that day ensured the mystery would last for decades. With the crime scene compromised and the weapons missing, the investigation quickly turned toward people. If evidence couldn't tell the story, maybe suspects could. And over the decades, several names rose and fell in the hunt for the truth. 3 men in particular have remained at the center of suspicion: a kiosk keeper, a German stranger, and a violent teenager who confessed behind bars. Of all the suspects, none looms larger in local memory than Carl Valdemar Gillström. The people of Espoo knew him, feared him, and in many ways expected him to be capable of murder. Gillström ran a small kiosk near Lake Bodom, but he was no friendly shopkeeper. He was known for his hostility toward campers and outsiders. Locals told stories of him cutting down tents, scattering ropes so the canvas would collapse in the night, laughing as people scrambled. Others remembered him throwing rocks at passers-by, or threatening youths who wandered too close to his road. He was violent, unpredictable, and often drunk. After the murders, whispers spread quickly. People in the village said they had seen him returning from the lake that morning, but fear kept them from speaking up. To them, the connection was obvious. Now when the rumors get strong, his wife shielded him. She gave him an alibi, claiming he had been at home with her during the night of the murders. Many locals believed he was hiding the murder weapons there, along with items taken from the campsite. Police did search the property, but no evidence was ever found. Next suspect was Hans Assmann, the stranger with stained clothes. If Gillström was the local suspect, Hans Assmann was the public's. A German-born man living just a few kilometers from the lake, he carried with him a dark reputation, rumored Nazi ties, whispers of being a KGB spy, and an unsettling presence that made him stand out in any crowd. On June 6th, the day after the murders, Assmann appeared at Helsinki Surgical Hospital. His fingernails were caked with dirt. His clothes were stained red. He was nervous, aggressive, even pretended to be unconscious. Doctors who treated him insisted the stains were blood. They urged the police to take his clothing as evidence, but the police did not. They accepted his alibi, dismissed the doctors, and moved on. The suspicions only grew stranger. After newspapers published a description of a blonde man seen walking away from the tent on the morning of the murders, Assmann quickly cut his long blonde hair. But still, the police strangely take no action. Over the years, Assmann's name continued to surface. Books linked him not only to the Lake Bodom murders, but also to at least 5 other unsolved homicides. A respected doctor, Jorma Palo, who had treated him in the hospital, became convinced of his guilt and even wrote extensively about him. Former detectives echoed the suspicions, and yet nothing stuck. Assman died in Sweden in the late 1990s. Never charged, never tried. He remained a suspect in the public imagination, a figure who seemed to carry guilt without consequence. For many, his hospital visit alone was enough to brand him forever as the man who got away. The last name tied to the Bodom case came not from neighbors or hospitals, but from behind prison walls. During the mid-1960s, an inmate named Pentti Soininen confessed to fellow prisoners that he was the Lake Bodom murderer. Violent by nature, with a reputation for aggression, his claim caught attention. But there was a problem. Soininen had only been 14 years old at the time of the murders. Could a boy that young really have overpowered 4 teenagers, 3 of them older than him? The idea stretched credibility. Even investigators who heard the confession struggled to believe it. Without evidence to back his claim, and with his age casting serious doubt, Soininen was never seriously pursued. His words joined the growing pile of leads that went nowhere. Each of these suspects seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle. And so, despite decades of suspicion, no charges ever stuck. Police dismissed confessions as drunken lies, ignored warnings from doctors, and questioned whether a 14-year-old could be capable of such brutality. One by one, the suspects slipped away, through suicide, through death, through disbelief. For more than 4 decades, the Lake Bodom murders sat cold. And then, in 2004, the case erupted back to life, with a twist no one expected. Police arrested the one person who had survived the massacre, Niels Gustafsson. It was a shocking move. For years, Gustafsson had been seen as a victim, the lone teenager who barely escaped the slaughter. His jaw had been broken, his cheekbones fractured, his body bloodied. But investigators claimed that new forensic work told a different story. According to them, Gustafsson wasn't just a survivor, he was the killer. The prosecution built a story around that June night in 1960. They argued that Gustafsson had been drinking heavily. Tensions grew inside the tent. At some point, they said, he was pushed out, like excluded from the group. A fight broke out with Seppo Boisman. Gustafsson's broken jaw, prosecutors claimed, came from losing that fight. Humiliated and enraged, he snapped. What followed, according to their theory, was a jealous rampage. Gustafsson struck first at his girlfriend, Mila Emily Björklund, the one who suffered the most brutal injuries. Then he turned on Boisman and Anjamaki, killing them inside the tent. Afterward, they claimed, he staged the scene, dragging items away, hiding his shoes nearly half a kilometer from the site, even inflicting superficial wounds on himself to appear as another victim of the attack. The most damning evidence, prosecutors said, was found on those shoes. Modern DNA testing revealed the blood of all 3 murdered teenagers, but not a drop of Gustafsson's own. If he had truly been attacked alongside them, they argued, his blood would have been there. Instead, the absence suggested that he had worn the shoes during the murders, then discarded them to hide his involvement. They even claimed he had slipped up in custody. One officer testified that Gustafsson muttered the words, "What's done is done. I'll get 15 years." For prosecutors, this was as good as a confession. But the defense tore holes in the case. Gustafsson's lawyer argued that his injuries were far too severe to be self-inflicted. A fractured jaw, shattered cheekbones, and deep wounds to the head. These were not scratches or surface cuts. These were blows delivered with real force. The kind of injuries that left him unconscious and barely alive. To suggest he had done it to himself was absurd. They also pointed to the state of the crime scene. From the very beginning, the evidence had been contaminated. Locals, journalists, even soldiers had trampled over it. How could any blood analysis be trusted when the chain of custody had been broken decades earlier? And then there were the eyewitnesses, the birdwatchers who saw a blonde man walking away from the tent around 6 in the morning. If Gustafsson was lying unconscious near the tent, who was that man? In the end, the court was not convinced. On October 7, 2005, Niels Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The evidence was too weak, too inconsistent. The prosecution couldn't provide a clear motive strong enough to justify such extreme violence, and the passage of 44 years made certainty impossible. For Gustafsson, the verdict was vindication, at least legally. The state of Finland awarded him 44,900 euros in compensation for wrongful detention and the mental suffering caused by the trial. The arrest, trial, and acquittal only added another layer of mystery to Lake Bodom. If not Gustafsson, then who? The suspects from the 1960s were dead. The evidence was broken, and the trail, once again, had gone cold. After all the trials, false leads, and decades of speculation, a book gave the case new weight. In 2016, Espoo politician Ulf Johansson published The Legend of Bodom. Now this book has some important evidence. Unlike the theories of outsiders, this account came from someone who had grown up by the lake, who knew the people and the fear that had hung over the community since 1960. Johansson pointed to a man the locals had always whispered about, the kiosk keeper, Carl Valdemar Gillström. According to Johansson and many others in Espoo, the Bodom murders were never really a mystery. They already knew who had done it. Gillström, or Valu as the villagers called him, was notorious long before the killings. He was the kind of man who turned beauty into menace. If anyone pitched a tent near his territory, he would storm down, slash the ropes so the canvas collapsed, and laugh as the campers scrambled. He hurled stones at children riding bicycles past his kiosk. He chased people off his road with a shotgun. There were even stories of him hiding razor blades in apples, a cruel trick for local boys who tried to steal fruit. Johansson described how the entire community lived in fear of him. Parents warned their children to keep away. People avoided his path, knowing he could lash out at any moment. He'd been admitted to a mental hospital during the war, diagnosed with violent and erratic behavior. His moods swung from calm to explosive, from manipulative charm to outright psychopathy. And what make him a strong suspect is his confessions. Not once, but 3 times, he admitted to neighbors that he was the Bodom killer. These weren't drunken rants blurted out in the fog of alcohol. Johansson emphasized that Gillström was sharp, even calculating when he drank. He knew what he was saying. To dismiss his words as drunken talk was to ignore the truth hiding in plain sight. But the police never pressed him. Part of the reason, Johansson argued, was language. The Espoo locals who spoke Swedish tried to tell investigators what they knew, but the detectives sent from Helsinki struggled with Swedish, and their testimony was lost in translation. What might have been direct leads became background noise, overlooked in the rush to close the case. Meanwhile, evidence, however small, continued to point toward an outsider at the scene. Decades later, investigators discovered DNA traces of a 5th person in or around the tent. It never matched Gustafsson, never matched the other victims, and never matched Gillström. But the possibility lingered. Had the kiosk man left a trace that went unidentified because no one bothered to test him? The final days of his life was the most damning. In 1969, 9 years after the murders, Gillström confessed again, this time during an argument with a neighbor. He admitted to being the killer, then asked what he should do. The neighbor, terrified, told him that if it was true, he should end his life by drowning rather than face prison. And you know what? After a few hours, Gillstrom walked into Lake Bodom and drowned himself. For Johansson, and for those who lived in the shadow of the lake, that was the end of it. The kiosk man was the murderer. He had terrorized them before, confessed to them after, and finally carried his guilt into the water. The police might have dismissed him, but the locals never did. What the legend of Bodom laid bare was not just suspicion, but a collective certainty. The community had always believed they knew the truth. To them, the tragedy wasn't that the case was unsolved, it was that it had been ignored. According to this book, the Lake Bodom murders weren't a mystery at all. They were a failure of translation, of policing, and of justice. And because of that failure, 3 teenagers never received the closure they deserved. More than 65 years have passed since that June morning, and still the Lake Bodom murders remain unsolved. The case has never truly gone cold in the public mind. It resurfaces again and again in new books, in documentaries that piece through the evidence frame by frame, in podcasts that dissect every theory, and even in horror films that reimagine the night as legend. Each retelling adds to the mythos, but the center remains the same: a crime without justice. Even the tent where the killings happen has been preserved. Today, it sits in the police museum in Tampere, a relic of the investigation and a reminder of what was lost that night: not only the lives of 3 teenagers, but also the chance to solve the crime properly. It is one of the most infamous artifacts in Finnish law enforcement. And yet, the truth remains unsettled. Some believe it drowned with the kiosk man in 1969, a final confession sinking with him into the same waters where the murders took place. Others argue that the real killer was never even touched by suspicion, that he slipped away in the early hours of June 5th and has lived the rest of his life in silence. Today, Lake Bodom looks serene once more. The water reflects the trees, the surface ripples in the wind. Families swim and fish as though the past never happened. But for those who know the story, the calm is an illusion. Beneath it lies a legend carved from violence, one that refuses to fade. Lake Bodom is beautiful, but it will forever be haunted.